Two murder investigations from the case files of Lieutenant Joe Kenda, a savage knife attack.
There were some things that just didn't make sense.
People behave in certain ways for a reason.
Police, open up!
Then,
Oh my God.
the discovery of a hidden confession opens the door to an age-old murder mystery.
1893? Yeah. How about fell off my chair?
Murder is murder. There's no statute of limitations, even from the Old West.
I want you to leave now.
This isn't self-defense. You are lying pure and simple. This country has always been armed to the teeth, and it certainly was in the Old West. Death, murder, assault was a very common thing. No one was surprised by it. People expected it. There's one thing that never changes: murder.
This was in a nice residential neighborhood, basically in the northeast part of Colorado Springs. Sheila Scott was in her kitchen baking cookies. She hears a knock,
Sheila, where's your phone?
and she finds that it's her neighbor, Jerry Denton.
Jerry, what happened?
Your phone, Sheila, I need it.
Jerry, you're back.
She's freaked that on his back there's blood.
Yeah, I need an ambulance. Look, my wife's been stabbed. I think she's dying.
Across town, Sergeant Joe Kenda is enjoying lunch from one of his favorite local food joints.
There was a hamburger stand in Colorado Springs that's now unfortunately out of business that made giant, oversized hamburgers. They were wonderful.
How's the dog?
The kids love him. He's a pain in my ass.
Still isn't housebroken yet?
Not yet, man. I'm trying my best. He won't listen to nothing I say.
I should try talking a little nicer to him.
Now you sound like my wife.
Dispatch to 4 Paul 1.
Go 4, Paul 1.
There's a call that comes over the radio, an attempted murder.
10-4, I'm on the way.
I guess duty calls. You gotta go.
When you receive a call in my line of work, just eat it or leave it and go do your job.
Good luck with the dog.
Yeah.
Hey, Skip.
Hey, Sergeant.
So what have we got?
2 victims, married couple, both suffered stab wounds.
I was one of the first detectives to arrive at the scene, and all we knew is that Jerry Denton, the husband, had a stab wound in his back, and his wife, Pat Denton, had actually been stabbed in the neck.
Took them both to the hospital. Jerry isn't in too bad shape, but word on his wife is she's unlikely to survive.
Any kids?
Yeah, they got 2, but they're both at school.
Jerry's a contractor for a development company, and Pat is a stay-at-home mom. And together, they have a nice little family.
So Jerry told the comm center that it was an intruder, but I'm not so sure we should rule him out just yet.
All right. Let's take a look inside.
The most common call that the police respond to is a domestic disturbance, where husbands and wives get into violent confrontations.
Was this something that happened between the two of them, or were there any other suspects?
This is where EMS found the body.
Detective Arms tells me that the house phone line had been cut, which explains why the 911 call was made from a neighbor's house.
What have we got in here?
In the house, there was a pile of clothes on the floor. That seemed out of place for this crime scene.
Who do you think they belong to?
Could be any number of people.
Is it the husband's clothes? Is it somebody else's? Somebody got undressed in here. Why would they do that?
I've got an idea. Where's the bedroom at?
Right this way.
So we went up to the master bedroom,
Wanna grab one of those?
found the husband's shoes, and compared the shoes to these.
The different sizes.
That led us to believe that they were not Jerry's clothes.
What if the missus has a boyfriend? Dad comes home, finds this undressed person in his house, and he assumes he's not a nudist who came in to use the phone, and the knife comes out.
Let's go see what else we got.
We go back downstairs. We go looking around. We find the patio door has been broken.
Sergeant, here, check this out.
Coins.
The physical evidence indicates this is a burglary. It's somebody who's doing a crime in this house, not a boyfriend of the wife, and not the husband.
So Pat and Jerry discover a burglar in the kitchen. He freaks and grabs a knife.
And whoever he is shouldn't be too hard to find. If those are the suspect's clothes on the floor in there, we got a guy running around in his underwear. Let's go.
Now, why does he get undressed? Well, that's the $64 question. People behave in certain ways for a reason. We just don't know what it is.
Kenda dispatch.
Kenda and I broadcast out to the officers in the immediate vicinity of the crime scene, warning them to be on the lookout for someone who is considered dangerous, would have only been wearing underwear and socks.
As the search commences, Kenda and Arms hope victim Jerry Denton might be able to bring some clarity to the investigation.
How's it going in here? Jerry, I'm Sergeant Kenda. You okay to talk?
Yeah, sure.
Do you know who did this to you and your wife?
Yes and no.
What do you mean?
There's this teen with brown hair. I don't know his name, but I think he lives on our street.
So now the question becomes simple. Which kid and in which house? This particular case involves a married couple who become victims of an incredibly violent crime. The husband knows that the perpetrator lives in the neighborhood.
Why don't you just start from the beginning?
Okay, well, it all started late this morning when I was at work. Yeah.
Something happened, but don't worry. April and I are fine.
What do you mean? What happened?
Pat tells him that there's a neighbor kid that came to the house this morning at 10 o'clock, and she recognized him, so she let him in.
Pat said he was acting strangely, so she sent April to her room. And then she said he pulled out a knife and he...
But she's able to talk him out of doing this, and he is able to basically have him eventually leave the house without engaging in any type of sexual assault.
And obviously, I'm freaking out as she's telling me all this. Are you at the police station now?
No, I'm at home.
What?
I don't think we need to call cops, sweetheart.
Honey, this is serious. You could be in danger. But why don't you drive over to my office? You can spend the rest of the day here.
Okay, well, I have to take April to kindergarten anyway, so I will see you in a little bit.
And that's when you called the police to tell them what happened?
No, we didn't call you guys that time. Pat wouldn't let me.
Why not exactly?
One of the ways that Pat got the perpetrator out of the house was to promise not to call the police if he didn't harm her.
I should have put my foot down and called, but we didn't. And then when we got home, that's when it happened.
Jerry tells us that he and Pat got home in separate cars, but essentially at the same time. Pat walks into the house, and Jerry initially goes to check the mail. He sees that Pat's been stabbed in the neck.
And that's when he got attacked from behind.
See, I saw him just standing there, this brown-haired teen. He was going crazy and stuff. And then he ran out of the house.
Did you see where he went?
No, but I'm guessing he went home because he was just in his underwear and socks. Maybe Pat might know in house. I don't know.
Okay, Jerry. Thank you. Hope you get better soon.
After learning more about his suspect,
Kenda dispatch.
Kenda makes necessary preparations.
So I notified the tactical unit commander that we may have a situation here where we're going to have to take a kid out of a house. I don't know yet. So they get their team assembled to stand by in the event that we determine location and identity.
In the meantime, Detectives hope to gather more information from Pat Denton herself. But there's one problem.
Pat couldn't talk. She'd had surgery to repair her throat.
I know you're not supposed to talk.
So we explain who we are and what we're doing. And I said, I know you're not supposed to speak to me, but can you write?
Can you tell us the name of the person that did this to you?
She writes David.
You know his last name? How about where he lives?
Mrs. Denton writes directly across the street, one house to the left.
Now, hang in there. You're gonna be okay.
And then she wrote something else. I looked at it and it said, why me?
I don't know why you, but we're gonna find the person that did this.
So I said, my dear, I know we will find him and we will punish him for what he has done.
Kenda dispatch.
Dispatch to Kenda.
With a name and address for their suspect,
10-4.
I'll be right over.
Kenda deploys the tactical team waiting on standby.
This is called a high-risk arrest. You're dealing with someone who exhibits violence, who announces he's insane. It is very dangerous.
Police, open up!
What?
David, where's David?
My son, he's in his bedroom.
All right, step outside, ma'am.
Well, what is this? David didn't do anything.
Ma'am, he's wanted in connection with an attempted murder that occurred this morning.
That's impossible. He's been with me all day. He's been sleeping.
All right, stay with her. Police department!
He's on the bed. Get out of the bed right now. Get out of the bed. Hands on your head. Turn around to the bed. Hands behind your back.
What's going on? I didn't do anything.
David, where were you between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m.?
I've been sleeping.
Let's clear this up.
The shoes we found in that house, the crime scene, are a size 10. David's are a size 7.
Go ahead and uncuff him. Sorry for the intrusion, David. Lynn, can you bring in Miss Andrews?
So at that point, we're kind of confused because we have David, but David's not our guy.
So much for the David lead. Apologies, Miss Andrews.
Wait. Are you guys looking for the other David?
The other David?
My friend David, he's been staying with us for a while. He's got some problems, I guess you could say.
Well, that would be the David that I'm looking for because he has a lot of problems, and he's about to have another one. The tactical unit has made entry into the suspect residence.
Are you guys looking for the other David?
We found a kid named David, and he's the wrong David. So I speak to Mom, and the mother says that David Dodson has come to live with them.
He's a 17-year-old kid. He does fit the description.
I thought he seemed like a good kid. He's pretty quiet.
So why was he staying here?
Well, he moved to the Springs from Oklahoma City a couple months ago, but things weren't working out at home.
The mother explains that David Dodson, he's kind of a lost soul. She felt sorry for him, and she allowed him to move in.
Have you seen David at all since this morning? We think he might have returned to get some clothes.
No, he hasn't been back.
Where is he now? This kid is naked, he's on foot. He needs to find clothing, and he needs to find a way out because he assumes, quite correctly, that the police are on his heels.
Excuse me, Sergeant. Got a report of a stolen car, 2 blocks from the crime scene.
Just like that. Another lead. Is this connected? It's just too close not to be.
Let's go. Excuse me.
Detectives head out to follow up on the potential lead of the stolen car.
I had it parked right there.
Were the keys in there?
Well, no, but I do leave a spare under my bumper.
Back in the days, we all had those little stick-on hide-a-key things. We all put them in the same place, which was brilliant because anybody who wanted to steal a car knew there was a handy key, like as not, right under the bumper.
Was there anything of value in the car?
Not really, just some cash. And my boyfriend left some clothes in there.
Clothes.
This kid gets incredibly lucky. He finds a truck that happens to have jeans, a shirt, and some sneakers. How does that happen?
So now our man has clothes, he's got money, and he's got transport. Now, where does a fugitive run to? Predictable places.
All right, well, thank you.
They go find their mama, their girlfriend, or their money.
Lieutenant Kenda, dispatch.
So I'm thinking now that maybe he's going back to Oklahoma.
I need a polo put out.
We put out an alert to all agencies in Oklahoma. We're looking for this stolen car that may contain a male David Dotson. We describe him.
Colorado Springs authorities keep up the search for their fugitive. But they turn up nothing. However, 2 days later, over 300 miles away in Oklahoma.
It looks like it, doesn't it?
It does.
5-4 dispatch. We got a matching vehicle, that Polo. Tag 870 Fox Ocean. Wolf. Hey, young man, what's your name?
Officers approached him.
David Dotson.
And he essentially blurted right out.
Stabbed 2 people in Colorado.
Go ahead and turn around for me.
Great. Simple enough.
Put your hand behind
Time
your
to put handcuffs on you. We extradite him from Oklahoma to Colorado to face charges.
In addition to confessing to the crime, David Dodson makes a shocking claim.
He indicated that he had taken some LSD that morning and also had been drinking. And so he was in sort of a hazy state of mind, if you will, when this whole thing happened.
Along with the suspect, Oklahoma City deputies send along something else, a taped confession.
My name is David Dotson. I stabbed a woman with a knife and then her husband. Then I stayed hidden a few hours until I stole that car.
There's no point in beating a dead horse.
That's it?
That's enough.
We prefer to get our own statement from him, but we have a statement. And we certainly have a surviving witness who can identify him. We don't need him to confess to us. He already did, the Oklahoma City Police Department. We take the cassette tape, put in evidence. You have a statement, accept it.
Detectives still have many questions, but luckily, there is someone who lived to tell the tale.
Pat Denton's recovering from her injuries, able to speak. She was going to be fine.
Did you know David Dotson prior to this?
I mean, I saw him around the neighborhood. That was about it. Good morning. I barely said 2 words to him. And then that morning, he shows up at the house. Hi.
Hi, I'm David from across the street. I was wondering if I could ask for a favor.
Oh, well, sure. What can I do for you?
This young man asked her for a cup of sugar.
How much do you need? April, why don't you go and play in your room for me, okay? Thank you.
Even though April was little, she saw him coming in and she could tell her mom was uncomfortable. Something was off.
I started talking. I made up a story. No, you don't want to do that, David. I'm dying, David. I have AIDS. What? Yeah.
That was really thinking on her feet, and she stuck with it.
Is everything okay?
Not really.
Well, why don't we sit down and talk about it? Would you like some coffee? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, it's
She eventually gets him to calm down.
If David had in fact taken LSD, it could explain his impressionable behavior.
Sometimes I feel like I'm dying, you know?
Yeah.
And nobody cares.
Within minutes, he was opening his heart to Pat.
Well, they should care.
She could tell he was a mess and genuinely saw this as an opportunity to get a fellow human being on the right path in life. That's just who she was.
You're not gonna call the cops, are you?
No, I promise. I'm not going to call the cops. David, if you'll excuse me, I really need to get my daughter to kindergarten. So,
She was very, very fortunate that she was able to talk him out of it.
Kenda believes that during the first encounter, David noticed the jars filled with coins.
He thinks about that as the day wears on, and he's still suffering from the effects of the LSD, but he decides now it's time to burglarize their house. When he sees Mrs. Denton come home, he then changes his mind. He decides to carry out what he was going to do before. He cuts the phone line, and he strips his clothes off. It doesn't make any sense that he does that, but that's what he does.
Well, you're lucky to be alive.
The surgeon said the blade missed her carotid artery by 1/8 of an inch. 1/8 of an inch is nothing. In her case, it meant her life.
She lived. So did Jerry. That's what really matters. They lived.
David Dodson pleads guilty and is sentenced to 16 years for attempted murder and 14 years for assault in the first degree.
There are several things that stick out to me about this case. One is that there were a lot of people who were really lucky because nobody died. An ironic little piece of luck happened to our perpetrator. He got real lucky when there was something he needed.
People are dangerous. When you see something, you tell someone. You don't rely on your word. Oh, please. To who? A criminal? Call the police. Call the police.
Coming up,
Dad, there's something kind of weird on here.
a startling discovery
Oh my God.
reveals a murderous history.
1893.
Yep. We found what is probably a dark family secret.
At this point, I'm thinking there's got to be something else.
Marguerite Buckley.
This is truly a voice from the grave.
Just 10 miles south of Colorado Springs, in the town of Fountain, Jim Eggleston has his hands full with his new home.
When we purchased the home, we knew we would have to do a lot of renovation because it was a very old home. We had to strip the molding from the windows so I could refinish them.
Here you go, honey.
I was trying to be very easy pulling all the molding off and then handing it to my daughter.
Hey, Dad, there's something kind of weird on here. It looks like handwriting.
Let me see. Yeah, you're right.
It was in pencil. It was hard to read at first because it was a different penmanship, you know, an old-time penmanship.
I, John W. Spicer, of the city of Fountain, something. Oh my God.
This is a murder confession.
The next morning, at the El Paso County District Attorney's Office, investigator Larry Martin is catching up on some paperwork.
Hey, Larry.
Oh, hey, Chief, how you doing?
Well, we've got something. I was hoping you could take a look at it.
It was on the back of a piece of molding in an old house in Fountain.
My chief said that he'd gotten a call from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation advising that they had in their possession a possible murder confession, so they contacted the district attorney's office to see if we would be willing to open an investigation.
That's mostly obscured by all this paint and stuff.
The lab at CBI is working on cleaning it up without removing the writing.
Right.
It's in pencil.
Upon examining this, I noticed right away that some particular words jumped out at me. I did kill and willfully murder.
Signed John Spicer. And there's this.
1893?
Yep.
Wow.
As a member of a modern police force, you don't get an opportunity to open a window into the past very often. In 1986, we ran across something extremely unusual, and it was a window into 100 years before that day.
Martin's first step will be determining whether this is a bona fide confession to an 1893 murder or a hoax.
This could be something that some teenager, perhaps maybe 15, 20 years ago, had done if he was living in the house.
When the investigator came over, I walked him in and showed him.
Right up there that the piece came from.
Okay. Now, I'm trying to get an idea of how old the molding actually is. Is it possible that it could have been put up with an earlier renovation, maybe 15, 20 years ago?
No, no way.
It was totally original construction. It had not been renovated before we purchased it. It was still in its natural state.
Do you know how old the house actually is?
Not exactly, but I remember the real estate agent telling me it's one of the oldest houses in all of Fountain.
Okay. Well, that would put it before the 1900s. Hey, this could be legit. Is this the rest of the molding that you pulled out?
Yeah, right here in the corner. Careful, there's nails in some of that there.
Okay. You didn't find anything else on any of these other ones?
No, we looked these up and down. We didn't find anything.
All right. Well, hey, I really appreciate it. Have a good day.
Hey, before you go, this murder, do you think it could have happened here in the house?
Well, that's one thing we're trying to figure out, but it's definitely a possibility.
I was going, oh my God. We were amazed and a little spooked.
After learning the house is one of the oldest in the area, Martin knows just where he can go to find its true age and more.
Larry Martin goes to the Pioneer Museum to see what records they had on when the house was built.
The Pioneers Museum houses records from Colorado Springs and El Paso County, and it's our largest local depository of historical information in the area.
Here's the deed to the property that you asked about.
The house was built in 1899. It's one of the first two-story homes built in the area, and it was a private residence.
It was owned by the Perkins family, and the builder was a John Spicer.
It's the guy who wrote the confession.
Oh.
So now it's starting to make sense. He built the house in 1899.
John Spicer was a carpenter. Many families around the area hired him to help build their homes.
Now, this was 6 years after the purported murder took place. This is when he could have decided to write that confession.
Someone once said guilt is a terrible thing, and it is. Release of that burden becomes paramount as people age.
John Spicer nailed it to a wall, hoping that in some time in the very far future, maybe somebody would find it. Now I'm thinking, this is no hoax. I've got a case that dates back 100 years, and where am I going to find the information I need?
One possibility is Colorado Springs Police. Could they have a century-old case file on this murder?
Larry, hey, Joe, take a look at this.
So I went to Joe, and once I laid it out to him, his eyes bugged out. He was very interested in this.
Wow.
This was an opportunity to look at things that I've always been interested in. History, one of my passions, and the Old West.
So how can I help? I think you can go through the police records and see if there's anything on this murder on the file.
I don't have to. They don't exist. CSPD wasn't around in 1893.
The actual municipal police department wasn't formed until 1901. Before that time, there were deputy marshals, and they were the law, and they dispensed justice on the spot in most cases.
So no police. The marshal didn't do much investigating back then. I say your best bet's the library.
Yeah, that was my next step. Give it a shot.
Listen, I know it's your case. But if you need any help, let me know. I'd love to help out.
Yeah, I will. Thanks, Joe.
So I was able to go to the Penrose Public Library and do some research on their old newspaper articles. In my research, though, I came across an article from the late 1950s where it mentioned a lady who was helping a family from Illinois find headstones for burial sites for some of the Locke and Spicer families.
Marguerite Buckley.
Is that a lead that I can maybe get more information on who John Spicer was?
Later that afternoon, Martin finds a phone number in the directory and gives it a try.
Hi, I'm looking for a Marguerite Buckley.
This is she.
Hi, Marguerite. This is Detective Larry Martin. I'm doing a little bit of research on a man named John Spicer, and I was wondering if you knew anything about him.
Well, I do. John Spicer was my father.
I about fell off my chair. What? I've got the daughter to the confessed killer?
All right, thank you so much, Ernie. All right, bye.
I called Joe and I said, let's go.
At her home, 89-year-old Marguerite Spicer Buckley happily shares stories of her father.
My dad had a lot of different jobs when I was growing up.
Marguerite explained he was sort of a general laborer. He worked in a railroad. He was a carpenter. He'd done what he had to do to survive and feed his family.
So he was a good father?
Well, not exactly. When he wasn't working, he was drinking somewhere.
She was very blunt that her dad was an ugly drunk. He was very mean. And when he started drinking, she would actually pour his whiskey for him and give him a lot of whiskey because she wanted him to pass out very quickly.
Daddy girl!
Sorry, Pop.
I ought to teach you a lesson for being so careless. Now get on my side before I change my mind.
Gambling, he got into that too.
In the 1880s, 1890s, gambling went hand in hand with drinking. That was their entertainment.
So I finally told her, I got to be honest with you. The reason I'm doing a history on him is he may have committed a murder.
We found what we believe to be a confession written by your father.
Her demeanor changed instantly.
If you don't mind, I want you to leave now. I'm tired. I don't think that I could be of any more use to you.
Thank you, man.
When you interview people as much as us, you know when you touch a nerve. You've found what is probably a dark family secret that they really don't want you to know. We need to get to the bottom of this. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation has been working on deciphering a confession to an 1893 murder. We believe that John Spicer killed someone, and we also believe that his daughter, Marguerite, knows something about it.
This is Investigator Martin.
I eventually get a telephone call from Agent Mooney of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation.
I've been working on this piece of wood you brought me.
He said he was able to decipher the name of the victim, John Sebastian.
We're still trying to clean up the rest of the confession.
Hey, this is great.
This is critical information, which we didn't have before. So now we have to look at this John Sebastian.
All right, we'll talk to you soon.
Who is he?
Martin and Kenda return to the Pioneers Museum to look through old city directories for traces of their victim.
So we go through these old records in the city directory, which at that time was a publication like a phone book. in the 19th century, where all residents of the city were identified by name, by occupation, by age, and by address. Literally, they would go knock on every door. Who are you, and what do you do, and do you live here alone, and so on.
And bang, 1893, we find the name John J. Sebastian. Lived in Colorado Springs, worked for the railroad.
The last time his name appears in the city directory is 1893. In the 1894 edition and beyond, no John Sebastian. Did he dry up and blow away, or did John Spicer kill him?
Once we learn about John Sebastian, it's clear we need to talk to Marguerite again to find out, did she know the Sebastian family? So Joe and I went down. We actually brought her some flowers, kind of a peace offering.
I know we sort of ended on a bad note.
Please, just sit down. I'm so glad you came back. It's time the truth came out.
I knew then. Okay, here it comes.
The story you're about to hear from me was told me by my mother, and it was told her by my father, John Spicer.
John Spicer told his wife he'd been hired to break some wild horses. And he was building a fence to contain these horses.
He heard a man sneaking up on him.
Give me your money. I'll cut you. Give me your money. Come on. What you got?
Spicer was forced to defend himself.
Marguerite tells me that her father struck this man in the head and it killed him. Marguerite said her dad searched through the man's pockets to try to find out who this person was, but there was no identification on him whatsoever.
He went and told the marshal who came out to investigate, and he determined that he had killed the man in self-defense.
The man who died, could his name have been John Sebastian?
No, I don't recognize the name. But the marshal always said that he probably was a drifter.
Marguerite Buckley did not know his name and only knew him as a drifter. That was a common term in the West in that period of time. People wandered around and picked up labor and picked up jobs, cowboy work, cattle work, fence building, and moved on to some other village and then did the same thing. And they were referred to as drifters.
At this point, I'm thinking, there's got to be something else.
Thank you so much. Pleasure. Why would Spicer tell his family he didn't know the guy's name, but then definitely write John Sebastian on the confession?
Maybe because he didn't want to tell his family the whole story. Maybe John Spicer isn't the hero he claimed to be.
I think Spicer's lying, pure and simple. You didn't talk to anybody, except to your wife. And when you talked to her, you lied to her.
Later that day, a call from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation sheds some more light on Kenda's theory.
Finally able to make out most of the confession. Spicer pretty much lays out everything. Apparently he hits this guy John Sebastian with a club to rob him for $5,000 worth of cash and jewelry.
This isn't self-defense. Spicer killed the guy for a reason.
That's a lot of money in 1893. In today's monetary value, that would be around $130,000 probably. There is no way John Sebastian could have earned that kind of money working for the railroad.
There are only two ways you can have that kind of money: through being a gold miner and having a successful claim in the mountains, or through gambling. And his daughter Marguerite tells us that he was a gambler. And I believe that's the common thread between John Spicer and Sebastian.
Put your money in, Sebastian.
John Spicer and John Sebastian met, perhaps through the railroad where they worked. They gambled. They drank. On this particular day, John Sebastian was the big winner. He wiped everybody out. Not only their money, but their rings, their watches, and any jewelry they may have had on them. You lose your cash, you want to try to win it back, so you put your watch up, you put your ring up, trying to win that money back.
Now, money, sex, and revenge, the three driving elements of homicide, have always been the case since the days of the Roman Empire, and this was no different.
Hand it over, Spicer.
John Spicer knew the wife was not going to be happy. He had squandered away all of his money.
Well, boys, it's been fun.
He needed to somehow get that money back.
Hey, Jada.
It's at this point, John Spicer himself lays out what happened next.
To whomever may happen to find this confession, on or about the first day of March, 1893, I, John W. Spicer, did kill and willfully murder with a club one John J. Sebastian. For his money and jewelry to the value of $5,000.
John Spicer left John Sebastian there to die, and probably wild animals would have got to it. The remains would never have been found.
In the West, even now, there are carnivores in the wild of Colorado. Mountain lions, bears, coyotes, every kind of description. So a body in Colorado in an unoccupied area, in 3 days you have bones because everybody's already picked it clean. Some of those bones have been dragged off and the remains have been scattered. The very common thing, Mother Nature has a very effective cleaner-upper department in the wild animals that are starving to death on the plains of Colorado. So he didn't have to bury him. Mother Nature would take care of that. He took the money. That's what he wanted.
With no one alive to arrest, Martin files a report with the district attorney's office, officially closing the case.
Larry Martin decided to donate the molding to the Fountain Valley Historical Society as a memory of that event because it was part of their history.
It is kind of the local lore now, and it's known as the murder board.
This is no doubt one of the most memorable cases of my career. I had fun working this case. I met some wonderful people working this case, and I went through some old archives that were very interesting to.
The night was bitterly cold, the kind of chill that bites into your bones, sending an unshakable shiver down your spine. It was December 16th, 1989, in Laredo, Texas, a town small enough that everyone knew everyone, or so they thought. That night, 16-year-old Emily Ramirez vanished without a trace. No warning, no noise, just gone. It wasn't until the next morning that her family realized she was missing. Emily had been at a friend's house just the night before, making plans for the holiday season. It was a routine she'd followed for years, a phone call to her mother to check in, a quiet walk home, the crisp evening air making her cheeks flush. She was supposed to be home by 10 p.m., but when the clock struck 11, then midnight, and still no sign of Emily, panic began to creep into the hearts of those who knew her best. Her mother, Maria, was the first to search the streets, calling her daughter's name in desperation. Then Emily's father, Gabriel, joined in. They scoured their neighborhood, stopping strangers, knocking on doors, asking anyone who would listen. "Have you seen Emily?" they begged. But no one had. There were no signs of a struggle, no scream, no trail of footprints leading anywhere. The police were called, and the search widened. Hours turned into days. The local community rallied, and posters with Emily's face were plastered on street corners, coffee shops, and telephone poles. Still, there was nothing. No clues, no evidence. The case quickly escalated from a missing persons report to a full-scale investigation. But Emily had no known enemies, no history of conflict with anyone. She was the kind of girl who kept to herself, but had a tight-knit circle of friends, a good student, a daughter who helped her mother cook, who took care of her younger brother. Nothing in her life suggested she had been caught in the crosshairs of something sinister. She wasn't involved in drugs or violence. Emily was a normal teenager, no signs of trouble, no unusual behavior. So what happened? The answer, it seemed, would never come. As the days stretched on without progress, hope slowly started to dwindle. The town had no answers, The police, despite their best efforts, couldn't piece together a motive, a suspect, or even the smallest detail that might lead to Emily's whereabouts. It wasn't long before the case was labeled a cold one, filed away with all the others that had fallen through the cracks of time and mystery. Years passed, then decades. The once bright faces of Emily's family turned sorrowful and weathered. Her mother, Maria, still kept her bedroom door cracked open every night, as if Emily might walk in at any moment, the same way she used to. But every morning, the empty room greeted her. Her father, Gabriel, stopped speaking of the night she disappeared. It became too painful. Even the memories seemed to haunt him. The whispers at the grocery store, the sideways glances when people asked about her, the questions from neighbors and family friends that no longer seemed to hold hope, but just a quiet judgment. Have you heard anything? Any news? It became the kind of question that cut through you, even though no one was trying to hurt you. It was a question that bore into your soul, an unspoken accusation. Why hadn't you found the answers yet? But the truth was, no one had the answers. Every year, on the anniversary of Emily's disappearance, her family lit a candle in her honor. But as the years passed, the flame of hope flickered and dimmed. Her story became another cold case, another haunting that never got solved. But that's not where this story ends. It doesn't stop with the cold embrace of unanswered questions. No. This case was about to be cracked wide open after 35 years. It all started with a phone call. Detective Mark Henderson had worked cases all over Texas. He was no rookie. He'd seen everything, from gang shootings to car chases to family murders. His career had spanned nearly 3 decades, but Emily's case was one that never left his mind. It had been on the shelf, collecting dust for years, a case no one had been able to solve. And there was a reason for that. The evidence was scarce. The suspects were almost non-existent. And in those early days, when Emily had first disappeared, there had been nothing. Nothing to latch onto, nothing that screamed foul play, nothing that hinted at the monster who had done this. But then, after 35 years, something changed. A new witness had come forward. A tip had been dropped into the hands of a colleague who, for reasons unclear, had decided it was time to dig into the past again. The voice on the other end of the phone was quiet, but it carried weight. "Detective Henderson, you remember Emily Ramirez?" The name sent a chill down his spine. Henderson had worked the case back when he was first starting out, but after all these years, the details had blurred. He remembered the feeling of hopelessness in the room when the case was closed, the way people gave up. He had been too young to make much of a difference then. But now, with experience on his side, he knew better. Something was wrong. Something was being missed. "Yeah, I remember," Henderson said, his voice cold but steady. "There's something you need to see, something we missed." The call was enough to spark his interest. The case file was retrieved, and within hours, he was staring at a photograph that would change everything. It wasn't much. Just a grainy image from a witness who had seen someone suspicious near Emily's home the night she disappeared. It was a faint image, the kind of photo that would usually be dismissed, but something about it caught Henderson's eye. It had been buried in the file all these years, and no one had ever really taken the time to look at it closely. The witness, a neighbor who lived 2 doors down from the Ramirez family, had seen someone hanging around Emily's street the night she vanished. But at the time, they hadn't thought much of it. They hadn't even remembered the man's face. It was just another figure in the dark, a shadow who had blended into the night. But now, with new forensic technology, the image was sharper. The face of the man was no longer a blur. And in that image, there was something familiar about the man, something that Henderson couldn't place. His gut told him this was the key, the missing link in a case that had haunted his career for years. As Henderson stared at the photo, a wave of realization hit him. This wasn't just a random witness. This wasn't just some passerby. This man, He had been in the town for years. He had been there before, and he had a history. The investigation was officially reopened. The discovery of the photograph was just the beginning, but the questions it raised were far from simple. Detective Mark Henderson knew that what he was staring at was more than just a blurry image. It was a clue, a thread that had been hidden in plain sight for over 3 decades. But even with the photograph in hand, Henderson knew this was just one small piece of the puzzle. One glimpse into the past that could lead to something far darker than anyone could have imagined. The man in the photo had been hanging around Emily's street the night she disappeared. But who was he? And why had no one remembered seeing him before? Henderson dug into the man's background, starting with what little information they had. The neighbor who had taken the photo, an elderly woman who lived 2 doors down from the Ramirez family, hadn't been able to recall much about him, just that he looked out of place, that his presence was unsettling. But even that vague description was enough to raise red flags. Henderson and his team pored over old records. They scoured every bit of information they could find on the night Emily had disappeared. They talked to people who had been in the neighborhood at the time, but most of them had already moved on with their lives, some having forgotten all but the most basic details. Yet there was one name that kept cropping up: Ben Callahan. Ben Callahan was not a name that had appeared in the case files before, but once Henderson started to look into him, it was clear that he had been a part of the town for years. He had grown up in Laredo, spent his entire life there, but he had always been a bit of a loner, a man who had kept to the shadows, the kind of person who slipped through the cracks and stayed out of the spotlight. A man whose name wasn't mentioned in the investigation back in 1989, but who seemed to be everywhere now. Henderson knew he needed to find out everything about Callahan, his past, his habits, his connections. The more they dug, the more they realized that Ben Callahan had a history of violence. It wasn't the kind of thing that made headlines, but the records were there, hidden in the dark corners of police archives. A string of minor offenses, a few run-ins with the law, some reports of strange behavior. But there was one thing that stood out. Callahan had a history of stalking young women, a pattern that, at the time, hadn't been connected to anything larger. As Henderson and his team dug deeper, they began to piece together a disturbing portrait of Ben Callahan, a man who had been around the Ramirez family more than anyone had realized. He had frequented the same places, frequented the same bars, and most troubling of all, he had been seen in the neighborhood on the night Emily disappeared. It wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't just an accidental encounter. Henderson knew that Callahan was the key. But was he the killer? Henderson's mind raced as he thought through the years. How many times had they missed him? How many times had they overlooked the small details, the overlooked suspects? What if the answer had been right in front of them all along? But there was still one problem. There was no physical evidence linking Callahan to Emily's disappearance. Nothing that could tie him directly to the scene. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing that screamed guilt. And yet, the more Henderson thought about it, the more he began to believe that Ben Callahan was more than just a suspect. He was the suspect. They brought in Callahan for questioning, a decision that would prove to be more complicated than they could have imagined. The interrogation room was sterile, white, cold, a place where the truth often emerged. Henderson sat across from Callahan, who was calm, almost too calm. His eyes darted around the room, but there was something about him that screamed discomfort. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not in a situation like this. "Ben, we have some questions for you," Henderson started, his voice steady, but with an edge of authority. "We're investigating the disappearance of Emily Ramirez. We know you were in the area on the night she vanished. Can you explain what you were doing?" Callahan's eyes flicked toward Henderson for just a moment, then dropped to his lap. He didn't answer immediately, the silence hanging thick in the air. "I don't know what you're talking about," he finally said, his voice quiet. Too quiet. "Really?" Henderson pressed. You don't remember being seen near the Ramirez house that night? You don't remember walking through the neighborhood? Callahan shifted in his seat, avoiding Henderson's gaze. It was a small move, but Henderson noticed it immediately. A sign of guilt? Or just the act of a man who knew the jig was up? I was just walking around. Callahan muttered, shrugging his shoulders. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Just walking. Just walking. Henderson repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. And what exactly were you walking around for? Because according to some of the neighbors, you were hanging around the Ramirez house a lot that night. Funny how that doesn't seem to be a coincidence. Callahan remained silent. It was a silence that screamed more than words could. Henderson leaned forward. We've been investigating this case for a long time, Ben. And I have to tell you, there's something about your story that doesn't add up. You may have fooled a lot of people, but I don't think you're going to fool us. We know you were there. We know you were near the house. And now, it's time to come clean. What happened to Emily? Callahan's eyes twitched, his breath shallow. For the first time, a crack in his facade appeared. But still, he didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at the table. Henderson didn't press him further. Not yet. He knew there were other ways to get what he needed. Sometimes you had to be patient. Sometimes you had to wait for the guilty to break under the weight of their own lies. But Henderson was sure of one thing. Ben Callahan knew what happened to Emily Ramirez. He wasn't just a bystander. He was involved. And it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. The investigation continued in the days that followed, but every step closer to the truth only seemed to make the case more tangled. The town of Laredo, once a place of relative peace, now felt heavy with suspicion. Could they have been living alongside the killer all these years? How had no one known? The answers were finally within reach. But as the investigation unfolded, the pieces started to come together in ways no one could have predicted. A breakthrough was coming, and when it did, the truth would shock everyone. Days passed after the interrogation of Ben Callahan. His silence had been deafening, almost calculated. An eerie calm that suggested more than mere guilt. It was as if he had been expecting the questions all along. But why? What did he know that no one else did? Detective Mark Henderson couldn't shake the feeling that he was so close. It was as if the walls of the past were finally starting to crack, but the answers kept slipping through his fingers. He knew he had to dig deeper, but he also knew that each new discovery would bring more questions. The more they learned about Callahan, the less they understood. But one thing was clear. The man was hiding something significant. The next step came from a source Henderson hadn't expected. An old friend of Callahan's, a man named James Walker, who had grown up in Laredo with him. James was reluctant to talk at first, but after a bit of persuasion and the promise of protection, he agreed to meet with Henderson. When he walked into the interview room, his face was drawn, tired. It was clear that life had not been kind to him, but there was something else in his eyes. Something that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. You're looking for answers about Emily, huh? James said quietly, sitting down across from Henderson. I've been wondering when you'd come knocking. Henderson didn't waste time. I need to know everything you know about Ben Callahan. Everything. James shifted in his seat, eyes darting around the room, almost as if he feared someone might overhear. Ben's always been different. He's got a darkness in him, you know? Always had it. Back when we were kids, people would talk about him, say he had a temper, but they also said he was a good guy, that he'd do anything for you if you asked. That's the thing about Ben. You never knew which side of him you were going to get. Henderson nodded. He had heard the same thing from others. Callahan was a man of contradictions, a quiet loner, yet oddly charming. Capable of kindness, but with an undercurrent of unpredictability that left people uneasy. Was he ever violent? Henderson asked. James hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, a few times. Small things at first. Bar fights, arguments that turned ugly. but it was always under control. People would forgive him. He was never really held accountable for the worst of it, but there were rumors. People talked about him being obsessed with certain women. Emily was one of them. Henderson leaned forward, his instincts kicking in. What do you mean? Obsessed? James looked down, his hands shaking slightly. He'd show up places he shouldn't be. Emily's house. Her school. He'd stand outside, watching her. I know people thought it was harmless. A guy with a crush, you know? But it wasn't harmless. It was like he couldn't let go of this idea of her, this fixation. Fixation. The word hit Henderson like a freight train. It was becoming clear that Emily wasn't just an innocent victim in this story. She had been a target, a focus of something much darker, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Did anyone ever confront him about it? Henderson asked. James shook his head, his face grim. No one ever really did. Ben was the kind of guy you didn't challenge. People were afraid of him, in their own way. I don't know if it was his size or just the way he carried himself, but people backed off. They saw the signs, but they never connected the dots. And by the time Emily disappeared, it was already too late. Henderson let the weight of James's words sink in. Callahan had been stalking Emily for months, maybe longer, and yet no one had ever connected the dots. The idea that Callahan's obsession had turned into something more sinister sent a cold shiver down Henderson's spine. But still, there was no physical evidence, no hard proof that Callahan had harmed Emily. It was all circumstantial, a web of suspicion, but no clear line leading to the truth. We need to talk to Ben again, Henderson said, standing up and pulling out his phone. Get him to talk. The following morning, Henderson and his team brought Callahan in for a second round of questioning. This time, Henderson was prepared. He wasn't going to let the man slip away again. The interrogation room felt suffocating as Callahan sat across from Henderson, his arms folded tightly, his face an unreadable mask. Ben, Henderson began, his voice steady but firm. We know about Emily. We know what you did. We've got witnesses who saw you outside her house. We've got people who remember you being obsessed with her. It's over. Callahan didn't flinch. He just stared at Henderson, his eyes cold and distant. You don't have anything on me. You can't prove a damn thing. Henderson pressed forward, refusing to back down. What happened that night, Ben? What did you do to Emily? For a moment, the silence between them was thick, suffocating. Henderson could see the way Callahan's jaw clenched, his body tense with restraint. And then, finally, the crack. Just a tiny one. I didn't hurt her. Callahan muttered under his breath, barely audible. But I know who did. Henderson's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Who? Callahan finally looked up at him, and for the first time, there was something resembling fear in his eyes. I wasn't the one, but I knew him. He was a friend. Someone who'd been watching her too. The bombshell dropped. Callahan wasn't the killer? Henderson felt a cold wave wash over him. He had been so sure, so certain. But now, it was like the ground had been ripped out from under him. Who is he? Henderson asked, his voice barely a whisper. Who's the man you're talking about? Callahan's face twisted in a strange mixture of fear and disgust. I'm not telling you! He spat. You want to know? You'll have to figure it out on your own. But Henderson wasn't going to let him off that easy. Ben, he pressed, his tone firm. You have to tell us. You know we're going to find him, and when we do, you'll be just as guilty as he is. Callahan's eyes darted around the room, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. You don't understand, he said, his voice shaking. He'll kill me if I tell you. He's not someone you want to mess with. Henderson felt his heart race as the pieces of the puzzle began to shift once again. There was another man involved, a man who had been lurking in the shadows, a man who had been hiding for years. And now, that man was about to be brought into the light. But the truth, as always, came at a price. As Henderson walked out of the interrogation room, his mind was racing. Ben Callahan was a piece of the puzzle, but he wasn't the whole story. The killer was still out there. But now, there was a lead, a name. And as much as Callahan had tried to hide it, the walls were closing in. The truth was coming. And when it did, it would shatter everything they thought they knew. The sound of the door clicking shut behind him echoed in Detective Mark Henderson's mind as he left the interrogation room. Ben Callahan's words had been like a splinter lodged deep in his thoughts, a painful, nagging doubt. "I wasn't the one," Callahan had said, and even though Henderson had tried to keep his focus on the suspect in front of him, a part of him was already moving past the man sitting there. Someone else had been involved. Someone else had been watching Emily. And now it was time to find out who. But who? Who could have been the other shadow in Emily's life? Who could have been hiding in the dark, right there in Laredo, while the investigation had chased the wrong lead for years? It wasn't just about solving a case anymore. It was about finding the truth, a truth that had been buried for far too long. Henderson had no intention of letting it stay there. After Callahan's revelation, the search for this mysterious second man had become an all-consuming obsession. Henderson could feel the weight of time pressing on his shoulders, but he didn't let it slow him down. Every second counted. Emily's family had waited too long for answers, and Henderson wasn't about to let them wait any longer. The first step was to trace back to the people who had known Callahan. Henderson couldn't take the risk of leaving any stone unturned. The quiet men in the bars, the ones who had watched Callahan over the years, they all needed to be questioned. Callahan may have been the silent one, but Henderson knew that in every quiet man there were whispers. And those whispers, he hoped, would lead him to the truth. There was one man who stood out, Robert "Bobby" Sykes, a friend of Callahan's, though Henderson had never heard much about him in connection to Emily before. Bobby Sykes was a local figure, known for his quick temper, his few friends, and his loud mouth. But no one had ever linked him to Emily. No one had ever connected him to the night she disappeared. Henderson's first stop was to the local bar where Bobby spent his nights. The atmosphere was dark, with flickering neon lights illuminating the dust-covered bottles lined along the shelves. The place reeked of stale beer and regret. It was exactly the type of place where someone like Bobby Sykes would blend in. The bartender didn't seem to recognize the name at first, but when Henderson flashed his badge, the man's face tightened, and he gave a hesitant nod. "Yeah, I remember Bobby. He used to come in here all the time. Real quiet guy, kept to himself mostly. But there was something off about him." "Off how?" Henderson pressed, his instincts sharpening. The bartender wiped his hands on the rag he was holding, then leaned in closer. "Just always watching people. And sometimes when he'd get drunk enough, he'd start talking about how he used to hang around with Ben Callahan, talking about old times, strange times. He was obsessed with something, but I don't know what. Never got the full story." It wasn't much, but it was enough to push Henderson forward. A few more questions to people who might have seen Bobby with Callahan, and Henderson had a name to investigate. But there was one problem. Bobby had vanished. Not just recently, but years ago. No one seemed to know where he went. Another ghost, swallowed up by the town and its history. Another piece of the puzzle slipping away. But there was something else that caught Henderson's attention. An old police report from years ago. A brief, inconspicuous mention of Bobby Sykes, a man who had once been involved in a minor assault charge. That charge was dismissed, swept under the rug, and quickly forgotten. But what had happened to Bobby in the years since? Where had he gone? After hours of digging, Henderson found himself standing in front of an abandoned house on the outskirts of Laredo. It wasn't much, just a run-down property, long neglected. But it was the last known address for Bobby Sykes. Henderson's heart raced as he approached the house. He had the feeling he was close. But to what, exactly? The killer? A new lead? A dead end? As he stepped onto the porch, His eyes scanned the yard. The place had the appearance of being forgotten. Unkempt grass, a mailbox hanging crooked, a front door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Henderson knocked firmly, waiting. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Finally, the door creaked open and a man appeared in the doorway. He was disheveled, older than Henderson expected, with a deep furrow on his brow. He looked like he hadn't seen the light of day in weeks. "You looking for something?" the man grumbled, his voice raspy. "I'm Detective Henderson," Henderson said, flashing his badge. "I'm investigating the disappearance of Emily Ramirez. I'd like to ask you a few questions about Bobby Sykes." The man's face went white. His eyes darted around, clearly nervous. "I don't know where he is. Never heard from him in years. He just up and left one day. You might want to try elsewhere." But Henderson wasn't buying it. He stepped closer. "I think you know more than you're letting on. Bobby's disappearance isn't as simple as you're making it seem. What happened to him? Where did he go?" The man shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. I really don't. But I do know that Bobby, he was different. He was always hanging around Ben, always talking about Emily. He didn't want anyone to know, but I saw it. I saw the way he looked at her. He didn't just like her. He wanted her. He didn't care what it took." Henderson's pulse quickened. "You're saying Bobby was obsessed with Emily?" The man nodded slowly, his eyes avoiding Henderson's. "Yeah, he was obsessed. And I think it got out of control. I don't know if he ever did anything, but I'll tell you this. Ben Callahan had a way of getting people to do things, a way of getting them to help him. And I think Bobby was one of those people." Henderson's mind was racing. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but it still wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed something concrete, something that would tie everything together. The breakthrough came when Henderson received an unexpected call from the lab. The DNA samples from the crime scene had been retested with newer technology, and this time they found a match. But not just any match. It was Bobby Sykes' DNA. For years they had believed the DNA belonged to Callahan, but it wasn't his. The DNA at the scene had belonged to Bobby Sykes all along, and now the man who had vanished so many years ago was finally linked to Emily's murder. Henderson sat back in his chair, staring at the phone. The truth was now undeniable. Bobby Sykes, in his obsession with Emily, had been the one to hurt her. And now, after all these years, he would finally have to answer for his crime. The town of Laredo would never be the same again. The darkness that had been lurking in the shadows for so long had been exposed. And with it, the brutal truth about what had happened to Emily Ramirez was finally revealed. But even with the killer caught, there was a sense of emptiness. For Emily's family, the years of waiting, the years of uncertainty, had taken their toll. The answer had come too late, but at least now they could finally lay their daughter to rest. The scars would never heal, but at least they had the truth. And sometimes, the truth was all they had left. The town of Laredo hadn't seen anything like it in decades. The news spread like wildfire. Bobby Sykes, the quiet man who had slipped into obscurity, was finally tied to the murder of Emily Ramirez. It was a revelation that shook everyone to the core, and as Henderson walked through the streets in the days following the announcement, he could feel the weight of the past heavy in the air. The people of Laredo had carried this darkness with them for 35 years, and now they were being forced to confront it. But for some, the truth was more than they could bear. For others, it was a strange kind of relief. The trial of Bobby Sykes had begun, and Henderson was there, sitting in the back, watching as the courtroom filled with tension. Emily's family sat in the front row, their faces a mixture of pain and disbelief. It was surreal, like watching a nightmare unfold in real time. But they had waited for this moment for so long. The truth was finally being revealed. Sykes sat at the defense table, looking every bit the part of a man who had lost control long ago. His once youthful features had been replaced by a hardened, weathered face, and his eyes betrayed a man who had spent years hiding behind lies and denial. He had never truly admitted to his role in Emily's death, not even when the evidence became undeniable. Instead, his defense team tried to spin a different narrative, that Sykes had been manipulated by Ben Callahan, the one person who had never been far from his side, the one man who had driven him to the edge. But Henderson knew the truth. The DNA evidence had placed Bobby Sykes at the scene. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. Callahan may have been a figure in Sykes's life, but he wasn't the mastermind. The darkness that led to Emily's death had been Sykes's own. His obsession had festered for years, and it had culminated in that fateful night. The prosecutor stood up and addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard the evidence. You've heard the testimony. And now you have the truth. Bobby Sykes wasn't just a bystander in this tragedy. He wasn't just a man swept up in someone else's plans. He was the one who took Emily from her family. He was the one who, driven by obsession, chose to end her life. He's the one who left her family in the dark for 35 years. Henderson's thoughts drifted as the prosecutor continued. He thought back to all the nights he had spent poring over case files, the long hours spent chasing down dead ends, the years of frustration that had been chipping away at him, like the slow erosion of a mountain. For so long, he had believed the case would never be solved. For so long, he had feared that Emily's family would never have answers. But now, they finally had them. It was bittersweet. Henderson remembered the first time he had met Emily's mother, Maria Ramirez. He had been a rookie detective back then, unsure of himself, still trying to make a name for himself in the department. He'd watched her as she clung to the hope that her daughter would come back, that somehow, against all odds, Emily would be found. Maria had cried in his office, telling him over and over again that she believed her daughter was out there somewhere, that she couldn't be gone, that this couldn't be real. The memory made his stomach tighten. He had told her that they would do everything in their power to find Emily. He had made promises, and for 35 years he had carried them with him. It had always felt like a personal failure that he hadn't been able to deliver. But now, he had. The truth had been uncovered, and Emily's family could finally begin the long, painful journey toward closure. The defense lawyer's voice broke through Henderson's thoughts. The prosecution wants you to believe that Bobby Sykes is a monster, that he's a cold-blooded killer. But I ask you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is he really the man who took Emily Ramirez's life? Or is he just another victim of circumstance? The world is full of broken people, and Bobby Sykes is no different. He didn't want to hurt anyone. He didn't want any of this to happen. He was just caught up in something he didn't understand. Henderson could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The defense was trying to humanize Sykes, to shift the blame, to make him seem like a helpless pawn in a larger game. It was a tactic that might have worked in a different case, but not this one. Not when the evidence was so overwhelming. Not when the community had already seen the darkness that had been lurking beneath the surface for so long. Henderson had worked too hard, fought too much to let Sykes off the hook. And the jury knew it. The testimony continued for days, each moment more draining than the last. But then, finally, the day came when the jury deliberated. Henderson sat with his colleagues, waiting, as the clock ticked on. They all knew the verdict was inevitable. Bobby Sykes was going to be convicted. The only question was how long it would take for the jury to reach their decision. 2 days later, the verdict came. The jury had reached a unanimous decision. Bobby Sykes was found guilty of the murder of Emily Ramirez. The courtroom erupted in shock and relief, the air thick with emotion. Emily's mother, Maria, was silent at first, her eyes locked on the defendant as he was escorted out of the room. She wasn't crying, not yet. But there was something in her gaze, something that said, finally, she had her daughter back. Finally, the truth had come home. Henderson watched her for a long moment, taking in the mix of pain and relief in her eyes. It wasn't the kind of victory anyone could truly celebrate. There were no winners in cases like this. There were only those left to pick up the pieces. Weeks passed after the trial, and things began to settle. Bobby Sykes was sentenced to life in prison, and the people of Laredo moved on, though they would never forget the dark truth that had come to light. Emily Ramirez's case, after all these years, was closed. But the scars, the ones left on her family, on the community, and even on Henderson, would never fade. The town had been forced to confront its own secrets, and though justice had been served, there was an undercurrent of unease, as if the very air had been poisoned by the truth. Henderson visited Emily's grave in the weeks that followed, standing in the quiet cemetery, his eyes lingering on the headstone. "We did it," he whispered, though the words felt hollow. There was no joy in this victory, no satisfaction, just the stark realization that some things can never be undone. But at least now, Emily's family could find some peace. At least now, they could mourn their daughter properly, without the unbearable weight of not knowing what had happened to her. For Mark Henderson, that was enough, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cemetery, he stood there, remembering the girl whose life had been stolen so young. Her face, once full of promise, would never be forgotten. And though justice had come too late, at least it had come. The months that followed Bobby Sykes's conviction were a time of quiet reflection for the town of Laredo. The streets, once marked by whispers and hidden fears, seemed to breathe easier, as if the weight of the past had finally lifted. But for those who had lived through the dark years, Emily Ramirez's family, the detectives who had spent decades chasing a ghost, the healing process was slow, tentative, and incomplete. For Detective Mark Henderson, the relief was short-lived. As he sat at his desk in the days after the trial, the papers in front of him seemed irrelevant. He had solved the case, brought the killer to justice, but the victory felt hollow. Emily's family, who had waited so long for this moment, had their answers. But at what cost? What price had they paid for all those years of uncertainty, all those years of pain? Henderson had spent most of his career chasing the truth, solving cases, and bringing closure to the broken. But Emily's case was different. It had been personal in a way that none of the others had been. The shadows of that empty bedroom, the grief of her family, the echoes of a town that had turned a blind eye, it all weighed heavily on him. It was a burden he couldn't shake, and so he sat there, alone in his office, staring at the same stack of case files that had plagued him for years. The case was solved. The killer was behind bars. But something was still missing. The feeling of justice had never fully arrived. Not for him, not for Emily, not for the people who had been left behind. Maria Ramirez spent her days quietly, alone in the house that had once been filled with the laughter and energy of a teenage daughter. The photos on the wall, the empty room, they were constant reminders of the daughter she had lost, and the daughter she had finally gotten back, in the form of truth. Yet, even as the conviction of Bobby Sykes brought her some measure of peace, she felt an emptiness she couldn't describe. It wasn't the kind of peace that filled the hole in her heart. It was just a hollow, aching quiet. She had been through the motions, attending the trial, standing by the sidelines as Henderson and the prosecutors laid out the damning evidence. She had seen Sykes in court, had listened to his defense, had witnessed the man who had stolen her daughter's life sit there, unmoved. But even as the judge sentenced him to life in prison, Maria couldn't bring herself to feel the satisfaction that everyone else seemed to expect. What did it matter that Sykes was behind bars? Emily would never come back. Nothing would bring her back. In the quiet moments, Maria found herself standing in Emily's room, staring at the bed that had once been occupied by a young girl full of promise, full of dreams. She would sometimes close her eyes and imagine Emily lying there, as if she could somehow will the past to rewrite itself. It was a fleeting thought, a moment of escape. But it was the only thing that offered her comfort, and for a few precious seconds, Maria could almost believe that Emily was still out there, still waiting to come home. But then the moment would pass, and the grief would wash over her once again. Henderson had never been a religious man. He didn't go to church, didn't speak much about God or fate. But sometimes, late at night, when he found himself unable to sleep, he would think about the way things had unfolded. He thought about the people whose lives had been shattered, about the families left behind, and about the ones who were still out there, the ones who were still victims, still waiting for their answers. Emily had been just a child when she disappeared. Her life had been taken from her in the blink of an eye, and for 35 years, the people who had loved her had carried the burden of that loss. What would they do now? How could they move forward after everything they had been through? One evening, Henderson drove out to the cemetery. It wasn't the first time he'd visited Emily's grave, but each time he went, it felt like he was walking through a different kind of darkness. There was no fanfare, no headlines. There was just the quiet of the graveyard, the weight of his own thoughts pressing on him like the stones that marked the graves of so many others. He walked over to the simple headstone that read, "Emily Ramirez, a life lost, a life remembered." He knelt down, placing a hand on the cool stone, his fingers tracing the letters. "I'm sorry it took so long," Henderson whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry we couldn't bring you home sooner, but we got him. He's locked away. I hope that brings you some peace, wherever you are." He stood there for a long time, letting the silence envelop him. There were no answers. Not really. There was no way to undo the damage. There was no way to give Emily back the years that had been stolen from her. But the case was closed, and that was something. It had to be enough. As the seasons changed, so too did the rhythm of life in Laredo. The town, which had once been gripped by fear and suspicion, now carried an air of somber reflection. People went about their lives, but there was a lingering sadness that clung to the air, like a fog that refused to lift. Maria Ramirez didn't attend church, but she found solace in the small things. The flowers that bloomed in her garden, the laughter of her grandchildren, the quiet moments when she could sit alone and remember the daughter she had lost. She had been forced to live without answers for so long, and now that she had them, it felt like the weight of the world had shifted off her shoulders. But it was an awkward shift, one that left her feeling lost in a world that had moved on without her. For Henderson, the case lingered in the back of his mind. He had solved the crime, but it didn't feel like a triumph. Every success felt overshadowed by the pain of those who were left behind. Emily's face would forever haunt him, and he wondered whether he would ever truly escape the shadows of her case. He had worked so hard to bring justice, but in the end, it was still a bitter pill to swallow. No one walked away from these things unchanged. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Henderson met with Maria at a local cafe. It had been a few months since the trial, and things had settled into a new kind of normal. They sat together in quiet conversation, the kind that comes when two people have shared something as dark and as personal as they had. "I've been thinking," Maria said softly, looking out the window at the sunset. "I'll never be whole again. I'll never get Emily back. But at least now I can say goodbye." Henderson nodded, understanding more than words could express. The past could never be erased. The pain could never be fully healed, but there was a kind of peace in finally having the truth. "Sometimes that's all we can ask for," he replied. And in that moment, as they both sat there, silent and at peace in their shared grief, they knew that the case of Emily Ramirez, though it had been closed, would never truly end. The echoes of her life would remain with them forever, a shadow they would carry for the rest of their days. But at least now, they knew the truth. At least now, Emily's spirit could finally rest. The courtroom had fallen silent after the sentencing. The echo of the judge's gavel had long faded, but its reverberations were still felt deeply within the walls of the town, in every home, and in every heart that had lived through the nightmare. Laredo, Texas, had finally breathed its collective sigh of relief. The decades-long mystery of Emily Ramirez's disappearance had come to an end. And yet, despite the guilty verdict, there was a sense that nothing had truly been resolved. The void Emily had left behind could not be filled by justice alone. For Detective Mark Henderson, the weight of solving the case was different now. He had always been a man driven by a need for answers. But after 35 years, after the pain of watching Emily's family suffer without closure, after all the dead ends, the sleepless nights, and the tiny glimmers of hope that always turned into disappointments, he had finally delivered. Yet as he walked through the streets of Laredo, something gnawed at him. There was no satisfaction in this victory. There was only the overwhelming sense that, no matter how much time passed, there would always be something missing. Months had passed since the trial. Bobby Sykes had been convicted and sent to prison for life, but the town was still reeling from the revelation. People were trying to return to normal, but normal had changed. How could it not, when the darkest secret in the town's history had finally been dragged into the light? For Henderson, the silence that followed the case's resolution was deafening. He spent long nights at the precinct, staring out of his office window at the moonlit streets, remembering the countless cases he had worked, the people he had met. He had solved them, one by one, as the years passed. But this case, this one had changed him. Emily Ramirez's face had haunted him like no other case before. It wasn't just her disappearance that disturbed him, but the fact that it had been allowed to go unresolved for so long. He had been a rookie detective when it all started, and now, 3 decades later, the ghosts of the past still loomed large. Henderson couldn't help but reflect on his own failures. He had promised Emily's parents that they would find answers, but there had been so many dead ends, so many years of waiting. And even now, with Sykes locked away, the feeling of not enough still lingered. What about the lives lost in between, the families torn apart? Would the truth ever really be enough? Maria Ramirez sat quietly in her daughter's room one evening, as the soft rustling of leaves outside the window whispered in the cool autumn air. The room, once a vibrant testament to Emily's youth, had grown quiet. The walls that had been adorned with posters of rock bands and school projects now stood bare, save for a few framed photos of Emily. Her hair was longer in those photos, her face fuller with youth and laughter. Maria ran her fingers over the edge of Emily's desk, still holding traces of the life her daughter had led. The books, now yellowed with time, were reminders of a time when Emily was just a teenager, full of potential. But all of that was gone. It had been stolen. And now, after all these years, the truth had come too late. She didn't feel the relief that others said she should. The sense of closure, the satisfaction of justice, it was all elusive. The pain of losing Emily could never be undone by a conviction. She had her answers, yes, but they didn't bring her daughter back. They didn't stop the nights when she would still wake up, expecting Emily to be there, to hear her voice calling out from her room. Maria had tried to live her life since the trial. She visited Emily's grave regularly, tending to the flowers that she now grew in her daughter's honor. Her family had tried to comfort her, but there was a distance now, a space that had opened up in her heart that nothing could fill, not even the truth. There were nights when she would sit alone, staring at the stars, and wonder if Emily had ever known how much she was loved. Wonder if the girl she had been was lost to the past, never to be reclaimed. "I did everything I could, Emily," she whispered, her voice trembling in the quiet of the night. "I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped hoping. But now I have to let you go." She knew in her heart that Emily would never really leave her. Her spirit would always linger, even if the woman she had been was now a memory, a ghost, fading slowly with time. But there was one thing that Maria knew with certainty. Emily was her daughter, and she would always be loved. Mark Henderson found himself back at Emily's gravesite a few months after the trial. He had been back many times since the verdict, each visit pulling him deeper into the grief that had marked the case. Emily had never had the chance to grow up, to chase her dreams. And no matter how much he had fought for justice, no matter how much he had achieved, it was impossible to undo the years that had been taken from her. The sun was beginning to set as Henderson stood at the grave, the shadows stretching long across the cemetery. He glanced at the name etched into the stone. Emily Ramirez. A life lost, a life remembered. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of the words. He had solved the case. The killer was behind bars. But the victory felt like a fragile thing, something that could shatter at any moment. The years of silence, of waiting, had left an imprint on this town, on these people, that no verdict could erase. Henderson knelt down, his hand resting gently on the cool stone. "I'm sorry, Emily. I did what I could. I hope you've found peace." It wasn't a question of whether justice had been served. It was a question of whether anyone, after everything that had happened, could truly heal. Could they ever live in a world where time had stolen so much from them? The pain, he realized, wasn't just the loss of one life. It was the decades that had been wasted. It was the lives that had been shaped by tragedy and never fully restored. As Henderson stood, he noticed something in the distance. A small group of people gathered at a nearby grave, their heads bowed in quiet mourning. They, too, were grappling with their own loss, their own sorrow. And Henderson understood, as he had come to understand so much over the years. Everyone carries something heavy. Everyone has a ghost they can't shake. Months turned into years, and life in Laredo began to settle into a new rhythm. The whispers that had once filled the air now faded into quiet conversation. Bobby Sykes had served his time behind bars, and the truth had been carved into the town's history. Emily's family had endured the worst, but they still carried her memory with them. Maria continued her visits to Emily's grave, and Mark Henderson still found himself lost in thought, late at night, wondering if there was more he could have done. If the case had truly brought closure, or if it was just another chapter in a story that would never have a happy ending. But there was one thing that remained constant. Emily Ramirez was not forgotten. Her life, her story, and the justice that had been finally served would live on in the hearts of those who had loved her. And in the end, that was the one thing that could never be taken away. The town of Laredo may have returned to normal, but the ghosts of the past would always remain, tucked away in the quiet corners of memory. And as long as those memories lived, so would Emily. The headlines had quieted, the photos had yellowed, the reporters had left town. But silence doesn't mean peace. In Laredo, silence just meant people were afraid to ask new questions. 3 months after Bobby Sykes was convicted, the town was trying to return to normal, if normal was still possible. The cafes reopened. Kids walked to school again. The Ramirez house, once a symbol of grief, stood still and grey at the edge of town, its porch light always on, like a promise made to the dark. Everyone said the same thing when they passed by it. At least it's over. But Detective Mark Henderson didn't believe that. He'd spent his entire career studying how darkness moves, how it hides, how it waits. He knew when something was finished, and this didn't feel finished, because sometimes, when you stare at the truth long enough, you start to see the parts that don't line up. It started with a photograph, a piece of evidence that should have been routine, meaningless even. A picture taken at Emily Ramirez's vigil back in 1989. A crowd gathered around candles, heads bowed, hands trembling. Henderson had seen it before, but one night he took it from the archive box, turned it over, and saw something he'd never noticed. In the bottom corner of the frame, blurred by motion, was a man standing just beyond the reach of the candlelight. The same man had been seen years later in a photograph from another investigation, a missing girl in Corpus Christi, 1991. Different town, same shadow, same stance. Henderson's pulse quickened. He traced the original evidence chain, and it led him to a retired officer named Larry Cortez, one of the men who'd handled Emily's file in those early days. Cortez lived alone now, out by the state line, in a trailer overlooking dry pasture land and broken fences. Henderson drove there under a cloudless sky, the air brittle and sharp. Cortez didn't open the door right away. When he did, he looked older than time, cigarette smoke curling around him like a ghost that refused to leave. "I thought this was done," he said. "Cases like this are never done," Henderson replied. They sat at the kitchen table. Dust settled on half-empty beer cans and stacks of unopened mail. Henderson slid the photo across the table. "You took this, didn't you?" Cortez studied it, his hands trembling slightly. "Yeah," he said after a pause. "I took it. Back when everyone still thought we'd find her alive." "Who's that?" Henderson asked, pointing to the shadow in the corner. Cortez looked closer and froze. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then, quietly, he muttered, "I know that face. He used to show up at the vigils. Said he was a volunteer, helping organize the search. Never gave his full name. Said folks called him Rick." "Rick what?" Cortez shook his head. "Never said. Just Rick. Always wore the same jacket. Had a patch on the sleeve, something like Riverbend Security." Henderson's blood ran cold. Riverbend, the same company that had once employed Bobby Sykes. Back at the precinct, Henderson dug through boxes of archived files. He found an employment list from Riverbend Security dated 1988 to 1993. Most of the names were unremarkable, guards, supervisors, drivers, but one name stood out. Richard Hale. The file said he'd been dismissed after an incident involving inappropriate contact with minors. No charges, no arrest, just a quiet termination and a warning note. Do not rehire. Henderson's gut twisted. A predator hiding in plain sight. The kind who slipped between cracks because no one wanted to look too closely. He tracked down an address from an old driver's license renewal in 1994, a derelict house on the outskirts of Beeville. The place was half buried in vines, windows boarded, the roof sagging under 30 years of storms. It looked like a house that didn't want to be remembered. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and rot. Henderson's flashlight cut across the walls, old newspaper clippings, maps, photos tacked up like a timeline of obsession. He recognized the faces. Emily Ramirez, Alyssa Delgado, Rebecca Collins. Different years, same pattern. Every girl had vanished within 20 miles of a Riverbend patrol route. There were also handwritten notes, fragments of thought, looping and uneven. Stars tell you where to look. Count them. Count her. Not the only one. Henderson's heart pounded. He radioed for backup, but his voice cracked halfway through. It wasn't fear. It was realization. The same message that had haunted him from the box. The same phrase scrawled on the back of the photograph. It wasn't from a taunting stranger. It was from someone inside the story. Someone who wanted to be found. They found Hale's body 2 days later. He'd been dead for years, buried shallow in a patch of land behind an abandoned warehouse near the border. The autopsy said 1996, maybe 1997. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the skull. There were no fingerprints left worth saving, no personal belongings except a rusted keychain with the letters RB etched into it. But there was something else, a piece of fabric caught beneath his fingernails. A uniform. Riverbend Security. And when the lab ran DNA on the fragment, it didn't match Hale. It matched Bobby Sykes. The revelation detonated through the department like a bomb. The man they'd just convicted, the killer they'd locked away for life, wasn't working alone. It had been a partnership, a chain of violence that spanned years, with each man feeding the other's darkness. Hale, the older predator, the teacher. Sykes, the younger, the follower. Together they'd perfected their cruelty. When Hale disappeared, Sykes had simply continued the ritual. The trophies, the pendants, the girls who never came home. The case had been bigger than anyone had imagined. Emily's story wasn't just a tragedy. It was one chapter in a pattern of horrors that stretched across Texas. Henderson didn't sleep for 3 days. He pored over files, photos, timelines. Every cold case within 200 miles was reopened, and one night, while cross-referencing incident reports, he found something that made his hands go still. A missing girl from 1993, last seen at a diner near the interstate. Witnesses reported seeing 2 men there that night. One of them fit Hale's description. The other, a man with dark hair, quiet, polite, introduced himself as Rick. Rick, the same alias Hale used, the same alias that had lingered on the lips of a retired officer for 35 years. But Hale was dead. So who had used the name after him? The truth came in fragments, like glass scattered in dirt. A chain of men, bound not by blood, but by obsession. One passing the sickness to another, a ritual of violence and imitation that survived even when its origin had rotted. The Riverbend network had fractured decades ago, but the echoes remained. Men who had once worked the same routes, patrolled the same dark parking lots, learned the same twisted rules. It wasn't a single monster. It was a pattern, a system. And Emily Ramirez had been the first name in a ledger that no one was supposed to find. Henderson stared at the caseboard, the faces staring back at him. So many eyes, so many years. He knew there would be no more arrests. The ones responsible were gone, their crimes swallowed by time and dirt. But he also knew he couldn't bury the story. The families deserved to know that their daughters hadn't vanished into chaos, that there was a shape to the darkness, a reason, even if it was monstrous. He prepared the final report. It would never make the news. It would never trend or go viral. But it would exist. And in that existence, the truth would live. On the anniversary of Emily's disappearance, Henderson drove to the Ramirez house. Maria was on the porch, a candle burning beside her, its flame bending in the wind. She always loved the stars, she said softly. I know, Henderson replied. They stood in silence, looking up at the Texas sky. Vast, endless, the same one that had watched over everything. After a moment, Maria spoke again. People say we finally got justice, but justice isn't what I wanted. I just wanted her to come home. Henderson nodded. He didn't have an answer. Maybe there wasn't one. As he turned to leave, he looked once more at the candle's flame flickering against the night, and for the first time he saw it for what it truly was, not a symbol of loss, but of defiance, of memory refusing to die. Because some stories never really end. They just burn quietly, waiting for someone brave enough to follow the smoke. The storm had passed, but the air still hummed with electricity. For a town that thought it could rest, peace had become a stranger. It was supposed to be over. Emily Ramirez's case was closed. The killers were either dead or in prison. The truth had been dug from the dirt, named, recorded, and sealed in a folder stamped, Final Report. But in Laredo, the word final had lost its meaning. You could feel it in the silence that followed every headline, in the way the wind moved through the empty lots where houses once stood. Detective Mark Henderson had stopped believing in endings a long time ago. He knew that the past didn't stay buried. It waited. and it was waiting again. The call came just after midnight. A missing person, teenage girl, 16, gone from her home in the span of an hour. The name was Lauren Pierce. The moment Henderson heard it, his chest tightened. The details were too familiar, too precise. Disappeared after leaving a friend's house. Phone left behind. No forced entry, no sign of struggle. Exactly like Emily, exactly like Alyssa. The ghosts were back. He didn't even wait for dispatch to finish. He grabbed his coat, his badge, and his notebook. The same one he'd carried since the Ramirez case reopened, and drove out into the night. Laredo's outskirts looked the same as they had 35 years ago. The same dirt roads, the same dying streetlights. The only thing different was the sound. The hum of a modern world that never stopped moving. But out here, time didn't care about progress. The land still held its secrets. Lauren Pierce lived 2 streets away from where Emily Ramirez had once lived. That couldn't be coincidence. By the time Henderson arrived, the house was a hive of activity. Officers at the door, flashing lights bouncing off the windows, neighbors gathered in quiet clusters, whispering prayers and suspicions. Lauren's mother sat on the porch, her hands trembling around a mug of untouched coffee. The air smelled like rain and fear. "She just walked out," the woman said, her voice breaking. "Said she'd be home before 10. She always calls me. Always." Then nothing. Henderson nodded. He'd heard it before. The same phrases, the same hollow disbelief. "Did she mention anyone new? Any friends we should know about?" The woman shook her head. "No, she's quiet. Keeps to herself. Just a normal kid." Normal? That word again. It was the same word Maria Ramirez had used the night Emily vanished. Inside Lauren's room, the air felt untouched, as if she'd just stepped out for a moment. Posters lined the walls, books stacked on the desk, a half-drunk soda can beside a laptop still open to a paused YouTube video. But on her nightstand, something caught Henderson's eye. A small pendant, a silver star. He froze. It wasn't the same make as Emily's, or Alyssa's, but the shape, the symbolism, was unmistakable. He picked it up carefully, feeling the chill of the metal against his skin. Whoever had taken Lauren Pierce knew exactly what they were doing. Back at the precinct, Henderson stared at the pendant under the harsh fluorescent light. It was new, not aged like the ones found decades ago. Clean metal, modern clasp, bought recently. But the message was ancient. A copycat? Maybe, but something about it didn't feel like imitation. It felt like inheritance. Someone had been paying attention. He ran the serial number on the pendant through the national database. The result came back within seconds. It had been purchased from a souvenir shop in Corpus Christi, one that had also sold identical pendants back in the late 1980s. The owner was different now, but the brand hadn't changed. History repeating itself, Henderson thought, not as coincidence, as ritual. Days passed. The search widened. Lauren Pierce's photo was everywhere. Social media, news channels, flyers stapled to telephone poles. The whole town moved like it was 1989 again. People retraced steps, reawakened old fears. And then the first call came in. A gas station clerk reported seeing a young girl matching Lauren's description. She'd been with a man. Middle-aged, tall, wearing a jacket with a patch on the sleeve. The clerk didn't catch the logo, but remembered the color. Blue. Riverbend blue. Henderson's stomach turned. The company had been defunct for decades, its name buried with scandal and blood. But the uniforms still existed. The patches. The identity. Someone was resurrecting the past. 2 days later, a tip came in from a long-haul trucker. He'd seen something strange on the old county highway. A car parked on the shoulder, hazard lights flashing, and a man standing beside it, waving at passing vehicles like he needed help. The trucker hadn't stopped, but the description matched. A blue jacket, a star-shaped patch. Henderson followed the lead himself. He drove out past the edge of town, through stretches of open desert that looked more like memory than landscape. The road was cracked, the air dry and humming with insects. And then he saw it, the skid marks, the faint outline of a car's tire tracks leading off the road, into the scrub. He followed them until he found the vehicle. Lauren's. The driver's door was open, the keys still in the ignition. No Lauren, no struggle, just a quiet, terrible emptiness. On the back seat, a folded note. It read, "She wanted to see the stars." The search consumed the next week. Dozens of volunteers, drones, dogs, nothing. The landscape was too wide, too open. The same emptiness that had hidden Emily all those years ago was hiding something again. Every night, Henderson drove the old Riverbend routes, the same patrol paths Hale and Sykes had once taken. He traced their movements through time, through maps, through silence. And as he drove, he began to notice it. A pattern. Every abduction had happened along the same perimeter, a crescent-shaped line running from Laredo to Beeville, curving north along the river. Every point connected by one forgotten landmark, a decommissioned train depot that once served as Riverbend's security headquarters. It had been abandoned for 30 years. He went alone. The depot stood like a fossil against the sky, half collapsed, eaten by rust, the tracks long since buried beneath weeds. The metal doors were chained, but one hinge hung loose. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the smell of rot and damp concrete. His flashlight beam caught the walls, graffiti, old posters, peeling paint. But beneath it all, carved into the surface with something sharp, were words that stopped him cold. Not the only one. The same handwriting, the same phrasing, the same ghost. At the center of the floor was a single chair, its metal frame rusted, a length of rope dangling from one arm, and beside it, something small, a phone. Lauren's. It buzzed once when he touched it, a low battery warning flashing across the cracked screen. There was one unsent message in the drafts folder. Henderson opened it. It said, "Mom, he said he knows Emily." The air left the room. Henderson staggered back. He knew what that meant. It wasn't a copycat. It wasn't coincidence. It was continuation. Someone who knew the old story. Maybe even someone who had lived through it. A survivor. A witness. A relative. Someone carrying the torch of obsession, trying to finish what the others had started, or rewrite what they couldn't. Lauren Pierce wasn't chosen at random. She was chosen because of proximity. To the place, to the memory, to the legend that Laredo could never outrun. Henderson called it in. Within an hour, the depot was flooded with flashing lights and uniforms. Evidence techs, detectives, reporters. But by then, Henderson knew, Lauren Pierce wasn't in that building. She was somewhere else. And someone, somewhere, had decided the story of Emily Ramirez wasn't over. Back at his desk, Henderson stared at the caseboard again. The names, the faces, the maps, the photographs. The same line of girls stretching across time. He added one more to the board. Lauren Pierce. Then slowly he drew a line from her name to Emily's. The pen didn't stop there. It kept moving toward a blank space he hadn't touched before. Because deep down, Henderson knew what the pattern was telling him. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about ritual. It was about legacy. Monsters don't die. They just change hands. That night, as the rain returned and thunder rolled low over the Texas plains, Henderson sat alone in his car, headlights off, watching the Ramirez house through the mist. The porch light still burned. A single candle still flickered by the window. And in that moment, he understood something terrible, something he'd known all along but refused to name. Some cold cases never thaw. They just wait for the next girl to disappear. And somewhere, in the darkness beyond the reach of that candlelight, someone was already watching. Rain came in sheets, slanting across the depot's busted windows like the sky was trying to wash the place clean and failing. The chalk on the wall, not the only one, bled into grey veins that looked like the building was learning to cry. Henderson stood with his palm against concrete that remembered more than any witness ever would, eyes closed, mapping the line from that sentence to Lauren's draft text, to the star pendant that wasn't old enough to be memory and wasn't new enough to be innocence. Legacy. Monsters that learned to keep time. He stopped pretending this was a copycat. It wasn't mimicry. It was apprenticeship. Inheritance. A ritual passed hand to hand in the dark. If the old Riverbend men were bones in the ground, then someone had built a new body from their rules. He pulled the pins back out of the map, let the thread fall, and started again. He circled the sites that mattered: the drive-in mural where the 12th star hid a jar of quartered Polaroids, the culvert that coughed up Emily's lettered star, the strip mall lots that once paid overtime for men in blue jackets to stand and watch the night. He drew a compass rose over Laredo and spun it slow. 5 points. A geometry mean enough to pretend to be fate. "Count the stars," the cassette had said. And he did. But this time he counted the empty spaces, the missing points of a shape no one wanted to see. The 5th point, the one that would complete the crooked star if you could draw it in the air, fell on a hill the maps called Coyote Overlook, and the town called nothing at all. A radio tower stood there like a nail punched through the sky. In '92, a Riverbend patrol log put a guard there 3 nights a week, a name redacted under ink that turned brittle and flaked if you rubbed it with a thumb. He didn't rub. He called a judge, got a warrant, and went hunting for a ghost with a rulebook. Lauren's phone told a story it wasn't meant to tell. Every draft is a confession with its shoelaces untied. Her messages weren't just to friends. Buried down in a folder the phone's owner probably thought was private, he found a string of DMs from an account called Rick Starguide. The avatar was a sky full of pixels and promises. The voice was soft. "Meteor shower this weekend. You'll love it." I knew Emily. She used to watch the night from the old drive-in. Sad what happened. But you're safe with me. Henderson felt the old heat rise up under his skin. Not rage, not yet. Recognition. This is how it works. You step into grief like it's a circle of trust, and you pitch a tent there. The IP trace ran back to a library terminal, where the clock on the wall had been broken since the Bush years. The camera over the desk was clearer than it had any right to be. The man wore a cap, a mask, a jacket the color of badgeless authority. Nothing to give away a face, everything to sell a feeling. On his sleeve, stitched careful, curved in the same tired arc. River Bend. A patch you could buy online for nostalgia's sake if nostalgia ever had the gall to sell itself for $8.99. He left a pamphlet on the free-take table. Amateur Astronomy Night. Stars over the South. Friday 9 p.m., Old Fairgrounds. No one had used the fairgrounds in a decade. The cattle barns disappeared into grass and rumors. The bleachers ate their own shadows. Henderson didn't like traps. Traps were for animals, and this thing they were chasing had learned too many human tricks. But he understood magnets, and he knew what kind of mines they pulled. He made a call to the brass and kept it short. "We announce a vigil," he said. "Not a sting. A vigil for Emily, for Alyssa, for all of them. Candles at the drive-in, under the painted stars. We post it just loud enough to hear from across the dark. We watch the edges, not the center. We let the town do what towns do when they're brave. Gather. If the man wants to own the ritual, he won't be able to stay away." Maria stood on the old gravel lot with the wind in her hair and a lighter in her hand like a tiny sword. Mothers came. Aunties, cousins, neighbors who had carried casseroles and silence for 35 years. Someone brought wind chimes that shouldn't have sounded pretty, but did. Someone else brought a box of tea lights and a Sharpie, wrote names on wax until the ink bled into curves. Henderson posted plain clothes around the screen, along the fence, near the gap where kids used to cut through and lovers used to learn secrets. He gave a nod to 2 decoys, one older, one young, both steady, and told them what to do if anyone asked them to see the stars. Dusk lowered like a curtain, and the mural stars began to glow with the last of the day. A man came in quiet from the far side, carried nothing but a coffee and the kind of stillness that knows how to hide in plain sight. Blue jacket, patch sewn on, not factory clean but careful, a thrift store resurrection. He kept distance, orbiting the edges, choosing his angle like a photographer pretending to be shy. Henderson watched his hands. Hands tell the truth. These hands were empty but busy, palms dragged along seams to map exits, fingers counting breaths. When the decoy girl stepped away from the cluster to adjust her mask, he found her without looking like he was looking. He offered a gentle voice, soft concern, a story about a meteor shower that would bloom over Coyote Overlook if you knew how to look upright. He said he knew Emily. He said he had been there. The decoy tilted her head, fed him the script Henderson had written in a room that smelled like old coffee. He bit down. Henderson moved without moving. The blue jacket shifted just a fraction, and a patch of metal under the hem flashed like a fish back underwater. A key fob clipped to a belt. On the plastic, the ghost of a logo half wiped away. Community SAF. The rest torn off by thumb or time. A van purred awake beyond the fence. Lights off. Old engine trying to remember how to purr quiet. He signaled with his throat mic, a click that told 4 people to be air and a 5th to be shadow. The man took a step with the decoy, and then opted the wrong thing. Not a badge, not a gun, just a posture that said no. Flight is a language. He spoke it fluent. He ran for the gap in the fence because, of course, he knew the gap. Everyone knew the gap, and Henderson let him have it because you don't close doors until you know what's on the other side. The van shuddered as the driver's door yawned open, and the man climbed in like the seat belonged to his spine. The tires chewed gravel. 2 unmarked cars slid in with no siren and too much decision. The van clipped a post, lurched, and spat a hubcap into the weeds like a coin rejected by a bad machine. Then the back end hopped, whined, and dropped. The spike strip a snake in the dust the man didn't see, until his choices were narrowed to one. Abandon the shell, or ride it to the grave. He chose the ditch. He always chooses the ditch, Henderson thought, because culverts are churches for men who love secrets. The van came to rest against a tangle of cane, and the sound of the engine died like a sentence with no verb. The man took the creek bed, boots sucking at mud, jacket darkening. The blue turning into any other night, Henderson followed him into the throat of the storm drain with a flashlight that made a long, accusing finger on concrete painted with stars, chalk, paint, charcoal, hands that had come down here to practice not being found and to rehearse a cosmos small enough to control. Halfway in, the sound changed. Not footsteps, not breath, a tapping, metal on metal, irregular at first, then urgent. He froze the beam and found a maintenance cage at the junction where 3 pipes met like hungry mouths. Wire fencing, an old padlock crusted into stubbornness. Behind it, a shape that moved wrong, too careful, too slow, and a face that flinched from light, then reached for it like heat. Lauren. Alive. Skin ghosted with cold, eyes blown wide, wrists bound to a chair with the kind of knot you learn when you spend too much time around rope. A gag cut from a T-shirt with a faded school logo. The cruelty of the ordinary. He said her name quietly so it didn't break. She nodded like the word hurt and kept tapping with her heel against a loose bolt. He took the lock in his hand and felt time rage in his knuckles. The bolt cutters in his bag were a heartbeat too far. He rapped the chain twice and leaned his weight, and the chain gave with a sound that felt like bone. He went low, hands up. The flashlight turned into a halo on the floor so she could see his face and decide if faces were still safe. "I'm Mark," he said, and it wasn't a badge so much as a promise. "I'm taking you home." He cut the plastic, gentle, saw the marks the plastic left, and swallowed the part of him that wants to kick the world. The radio at his shoulder hissed that the perimeter had holes. Perimeters always have holes. He called for medics, voice level, and then the air behind him changed pressure. The man has a smell now, he thought. Adrenalized sweat and creek water and terror dressed up as boldness. The first swing was clumsy, a pipe arcing for the skull, because habit says end the witness. Henderson turned, took it on the shoulder, and the pain lit his arm on fire, but didn't put the fire out in his legs. He drove forward, not pretty, not trained, just weight and want. They hit the floor hard. The pipe clanged into shadow. Close. You see things you wish you didn't. A scar that looks like an old dog's bite. A nick on the ear where a high school ring taught him about physics. Eyes that are nothing like a monster's because they're human. And that's the worst part. Henderson recognized the unbelief there, not at getting caught, but at being dragged into someone else's light. The man clawed for the pipe, found the chain, looped it like a garrote because technique travels across time. Henderson tucked his chin, levered the link with the bone of his wrist, heard something in his own arm say, "Careful." He tasted rust. He heard Lauren whisper please in a voice that was all air. Boots scuffed on concrete behind them. Good boots. His boots. And the man knew the math. He tore away like fabric and slipped into the smallness at the wall where a skinny man can pretend to be shadow. Henderson lunged and got a handful of jacket, felt stitches rip, came away with cloth and a patch and a pocket full of paper that fluttered like dead leaves. Quartered photos. The old trick. Corners of eyes, slivers of letters. An L punched off a cheap star pendant, not yet dull with years. There was blood on the edge of one square, not fresh enough to shine, not old enough to forget. He shouted, tunnel left, and the echo lied for the man, magnified him into 6 directions at once. They took Lauren out in a blanket they use for survival, and for ceremonies that look like survival. She walked because she wanted to, because walking is a way to tell your body it's still yours. Under the floodlights, her face learned how to stop flinching. Maria's candle burned in the wind across town and didn't go out. The night had teeth, but the teeth were tired. Henderson stood in the mouth of the drain with the patch in his hand and stared down the pipe, the way you stare down a story that refuses to end. The patch said, River Bend with a threadbare pride, and under it, where a name tape should have been, only sticky residue, the color of old smoke. They cleared the drive-in with soft voices and a silence that wasn't fear this time, just wait. Volunteers packed away candles with the care people give to small flames after they've watched a big one. Someone sang a line of a hymn without meaning to. The decoy girl sat on the bumper of an ambulance, alive in the loud way relief is alive. Henderson let the medics tape his shoulder and said he'd be fine, which was a lie, and also